Have you ever thought about whether all the animals that the Bible het over, die stierven in de zondvloed, echt werden gedood? For a moment, let's say that the Nephilim, who are huge creatures, might have lived through this huge damage. Strangely, old books, like the supposedly untrue Book of Enoch, say that these powerful people found a way to get away from the disaster. How could the Nephilim have lived through the flood that the Bible talks about so carefully? Apocryphal books, like the Book of Enoch, say that the Nephilim either hid in the earth's depths or were saved by heavenly action that isn't mentioned in canonical books. This story suggests that it's possible that these beings found ways to stay alive while the earth was cleansed of its evil. What part did the Watchers spelen in what happened to the Nephilim na de zondvloed? In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are fallen angels who were the parents of the Nephilim and, despite what you might think, continued to have an effect on their children and grandchildren. The text says that they gave the Nephilim geheime informatie en vaardigheden die hen hielpen te overleven en zelfs goed te doen in een wereld na de Big Bang. But the Book of Giants, which is also an apocryphal book, gives a thorough account of what happened to the Nephilim, which suggests that they not only lived, but also played important parts in stories that happened after the flood. Several places in the Bible talk about giants still living, which suggests that the Nephilim's impact was still felt by later generations. The Nephilim were said to have irrational tempers and never-ending hunger. They constantly broke nature and divine rules by destroying crops, eating animals and mensen, and in some stories, zelfs elkaar etend. Their presence brings up deep questions about how the universe works and what happens when celestial sins gebeuren. Apocryphal texts often talk about how complicated the connection is between the Nephilim, their heavenly parents, and people. There are many stories and tales that question our ideas about what is divine and what is moral because of this interaction between the divine and the mundane, between the holy and the common. When we look at the story of the Nephilim and the Watchers, we have to think about how far God can go and how strong mythical beings can be. These stories not only help us understand holy and mythical works better, but they also make us think about how complicated good and evil, justice and redemption are. If you're interested in learning more about old mysteries and the stories of biblical giants, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss any shows. Send this video to people you know who also like to find out about the past. Let's look for more stories like this one that are interesting and captivating. Also, if you want to help this job, please leave a super thanks. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your donation. Thank you so much for your help as the story of this amazing event is told again. After the global flood, Die was meant to get rid of all evil on earth, were people once again at the mercy of forces that didn't follow God's rules. The people's cries of pain could be heard in the skies, and the gods were furious. They knew that the Watchers, who used to be guardian angels, had broken their trust, creating the Nephilim. These disobedient beings caused damage overall where they went, which upset the order of creation. God wanted to stop this new wave of damage, so he sent his archangels, who are very powerful and always loyal, to fix the problems that the Watchers and their children and grandchildren had caused. The first one, the Archangel Michael, would talk to Sunyasa, who was in charge of the Watchers, and hadn't stopped his followers from giving in to temptation and turning into fallen angels. This fight between Miguel and Sunyasa was very important because it would decide the fates of many people and show how much control heaven still had over the heavenly rebels. While Michael fought, Raphael, an archangel, had to face Azazel, another Watcher who had taught people how to fight and use weapons by sharing heavenly secrets with them. Men were fighting and killing each other because of Azazel's deeds. Raphael would punish Azazel with divine justice to stop the fights he started. The watchful deity Uriel ontmoette Noah op hetzelfde moment. Noah was picked to protect human innocence. Uriel told Noah that a great disaster was about to happen and that he and his family should find a safe place to stay because they would be the only ones who would make it through the purification. Uriel told Noah that the seed of humanity would be kept safe, which would give the world a new chance. The archangel Gabriel, on the other hand, was sent straight to the center of the Nephilim group, which was led by Didmar. According to the holy books, Gabriel's clear and terrible job was to kill all the Nephilim, who were described as scum and villains. Gabriel set off a series of brutal fights in which the Nephilim were encouraged to turn on each other. This was a divine plan to lower their numbers without heaven getting involved directly. The killing that followed was horrible, but it had to happen. Gabriel saw how the Nephilim killed each other out of anger and betrayal. The survivors of this bloody war would soon die in the flood. God sent the flood not only to kill the Nephilim, but also as a sign that the earth would be clean of all sin. Only Noah and his family would be left to witness a new bond between heaven and people. This divine action not only showed how strong the gods are, but it also confirmed the promise that people all tied would be able to start over, free from the mistakes they had made in the past, even if celestial beings had problems and failed. The story of the Nephilim and the Watchers would always show what happens when you don't do what God says, and how faith and doing what God wants can save you. Many people thought that all of the Nephilim of Reusen waren gedood door de zondvloed. On the other hand, the story takes a strange turn when we learn that the monster's souls liefden, ook al werden hun lichamen gedood. People think of these souls, who no longer have bodies, as evil beings that roam the earth and cause trouble and destruction. The revelations that were given to Enoch said that these spirits would continue to hurt and abuse people, not being able to eat or drink. These ghosts would always be thirsty and hungry, which would make them do bad things and cause disasters. In a strange way, they would rise up against men and women who were part of their eigen beginning, wat hun leven nog tragischer maakte. Even though it was spiritual, this new way of life for the Nephilim was just as harmful as their old one. They could, however, scare and destroy in some way, carrying on the violence they started when they came to life. The giants would no longer be around, maar hun impact zou voortleven. What it really meant was the start of a new age of spiritual terror. The story said that the fact that these spirits would always be terrible enemies was a way for God to punish people. By letting those souls leaven, God was also punishing people for wrongdoings they had done in the past. Over time, people became connected with the Watchers and learned and often abused the holy secrets they were told. The women were then seduced by the fallen angels, so they helped make the Nephilim, either by being persuaded or forced to become one. The story of the Nephilim was a sad reflection of the good and bad things about people through those spirits. The Enochian tale not only tells us where these spirits came from, but it also shows how complicated the relationship is between God and people, between punishment and kindness. Even as spirits waren de Nephilim een representatie van de resultaten van wat mensen en goden deden. The story of the Nephilim is told from a different point of view in this story, which is based on the Book of Giants, an unfinished book. In this case, the story is told not only as a set of celestial events, but also as a reflection of human and Nephilim battles and the punishments they face. The story of those giants, both in their physical and spiritual forms, is a strong reminder of what happens when people disobey God and how God's justice always tries to bring order and morals back to the world. The story of the Nephilim became even more personal and sad after the flood, when there were a lot of major events. One of the giants that was still alive, Maui, started having scary dreams with his friends. Because these dreams were so real and scary, Maui began to think about what he had done in the past and whether he was going to be punished by God. In his search for answers, Maui found Enoch, a wise man who, according to law, could read people's dreams and visions. Maui's fears were confirmed by Enoch. In fact, The dreams were a bad sign that the giants' deeds and the deaths they had caused would have terrible results. Enoch said that there was a chance of being saved, but it would be hard to get there, and people would have to really give up evil. Even though there was a chance of pardon, truth was always there. According to the Enochian legend, God was unhappy with the Nephilim's attempts to change, so he chose to send a flood to kill them all and wash the earth clean of their bad impact. People who were able to get away from the terrible water were chased by angels who were sent to carry out God's will. In an even more shocking turn of events, the Manichaean version of the Book of Giants says that God called up the legendary monster Leviathan to hunt down the Nephilim who had escaped the flood. This huge being, which is often linked to chaos and damage, was the perfect way to make sure that none of the giants got away with their crimes. Even though these stories aren't all complete and come from different sources, they all agree on one thing. God carefully destroyed the Nephilim, both physically and mentally. The book of Genesis supports this theory because it says that the Nephilim lived on earth both during and after those times. This means that the stories about their interactions with human girls, Meer dan Alleen Verhalen Warren. People have called these stories over giants heroes of antiquity, or renowned heroes. They stand out not only for the amazing things they did, but also for how sad they are. The Bible text, unlike the Book of Enoch, doesn't say exactly how the Watchers made the Nephilim. Instead, it makes hints that the sons of God and the girls of humans got together, which led to the creation of these mythical figures. In the next chapter of the Bible, which talks about the flood, the Nephilim's continued presence as evil spirits is not addressed. This difference in language allows for different ideas about what happened to these creatures in the end. The conflict between the Bible text and the apocryphal sources makes a patchwork of stories that show how complicated the connection is between God, people, and monsters. Following the worldwide disaster known as the flood, all living things die niet in de ark van Noach schuilde, werden uitgeroeid, volgens de Bijbel. No living thing survived except those on the ark because the water rose to cover the mountains more than 15 cubits high. The account is clear and complete. The waves killed birds, livestock, wild animals, and all living things on earth, including people. Except for the small sample that Noah kept, all known life was wiped out by God as a way to make things clean. In later writings, though, the story of the Nephilim takes an interesting and sometimes strange turn. Numbers tells the story of how Moses sent spies to check out Canaan, which was God's promised place for the Israelites. The scouts' job was to look at the land and its people and decide if they were weak or strong, if the towns were safe or at risk, and if the land was rich or empty. This reconnaissance was very important for getting the Israelites ready for the coming invasion. But what the spies found in Canaan was even scarier than they thought it would be. It was a rich land that flowed with honey and milk, and the people who lived there were strong and lived in strong towns. The most shocking thing, though, was dat de Nephilim terugwaren. This made the spies very happy. The people told Moses that the land eats its inhabitants and that all of its people are very tall, including the relatives of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. This story did it seem like the flood might not have completely wiped out the Nephilim. The spies said that the giants were als grasshoppers vergelijken met hen. This picture showed not only how different they eruit zagen, maar ook hoe eng de Nephilim waren. Even though the flood was supposed to have destroyed everything, these beings were still there, which suggests that some may have found ways to stay alive until the water level dropped. For example, they may have learned how to navigate the rough waters or found safe places that were out of reach. The Nephilim's resilience, as shown in Numbers, calls into question the idea of a final and total judgment. Although God may not have meant for these creatures to be strong, their resilience and ability to change made them strong enough to survive even the worst natural tragedies. This reveal shows not only how complicated God's plans are, but it also shows how the established order and those who want to change het altijd met elkaar in conflict zijn. So the story of the Nephilim, which goes beyond the flood, continues to fascinate and puzzle people, exploring themes of survival, divine challenge, and the unbreakable link between humans and the supernatural. The story of the Nephilim comes up again to show that stories about extinction can actually be the start of new parts of the endless past between heaven and earth. After the flood, stories about the Nephilim kept coming up in mysterious and controversial ways, showing that these huge beings and their traditions were not totally wiped out. The Book of Giants suggests that the Nephilim may have found ways to avoid the terrible disaster through creativity or old magic. This idea is interesting, but it is not supported by either canonical or apocryphal texten. So, a more reasonable and theologisch sound theory is that the Nephilim die Moses' spies in Canaan vonden misschien niet dezelfde zijn als die in Noach's tijd leefden. They might be Nephilim who were born in similar situations to the first generation, but this time by a new group of lost angels who don't learn from the mistakes of the first generation, because they were drawn to menselijk vrouwen, may have ended up on the same sad road as the first watchers, breaking God's rules and creating new Nephilim. Apocryphal texts say that the original watchers were locked up by the archangels in a deep underground jail in the desert called Dudel. They are still there, suffering for their sins. Based on what else is said in the Bible, the events in Numbers probably happened many years after the time of the watchers. This means that it's possible that other angels made the same mistakes. This pattern of making the same mistakes over and over again, even though they knew what would happen, shows that the celestial beings were weak and easily tempted, even though they knew what would happen to the watchers. On the other hand, there is a different theory that asks whether the sons of God that are talked about in Genesis 6:4 are really angels or specific human lines. Suppose these sons of God worn mannen, then the idea that they could have had children met women en kinderen gekregen en de Nephilim geboren is een hele nieuwe betekenis. This view suggests that the curse on Canaan, Noah's son and the ancestor of the Canaanites, may have been linked to other curses on his children and grandchildren, such as the possible appearance of giants called the Nephilim through marriages between people in this lineage. The idea behind this line of thinking is that the Nephilim may have thought the offspring of Canaan, especially those who were born when the sons of Shem and Japheth married the daughters of Canaan, were horrible. This would have kept the Nephilim alive op earth. This theory gives a different reason for why the Nephilim in Canaan bleven. It connects Bible events from the past with religious questions about wat deze vreemde wezens zijn en waar ze vandaan komen. So the story of the Nephilim is still the subject of heated arguments and guesses. This shows how hard it is to understand the Bible on andere Geschriften. There is a lot of room for religious and storytelling exploration in the idea that the story of the Nephilim could be both the result of repeated violations of heaven's laws and complex human curses. When the Israelites moved to the area around Canaan, they weren't tempted to mix with the local people, even though God told them over and over again not to. The contact with the Canaanites, who were often called cursed because of the curse that was put on Canaan, Noah's son, made people very worried about what would happen in these relationships. The main worry was that these kinds of unions could produce a new generation of Nephilim, whose offspring would likely receive and show the horrible traits associated with those mythical giants. It's possible that new Nephilim appeared because of what the chosen people of Israel did. This shows how complicated the relationship is between divine choice and human duty. While it's hard to show for sure that the Nephilim were directly caused by those unions, the idea is a powerful warning of what happens when people don't follow God's instructions. The idea that the sons of God die in the Bible might actually fallen angels zijn in plaats van mensen is ook een geldige religieuze theorie. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, People are often called sons of man because they are descended from Adam. There is more to the story of the Nephilim, na het lezen over de reizigers in Numeri 13. It was suggested that the explorers might have mistaken the tall men of Canaan for Nephilim of zelfs verzonnen verhalen over reuzen, uit angst voor de sterke Canaanitische strijders en de fortificaties. This is a common psychologische reaction that happens when people are very scared or unsure. This story about a bad report makes me think that the reports that were given to Moses may have been skewed or overblown out of fear or a dislike of the thought of meeting a strong enemy. In Bible stories, Anak and his children, the Anakim, are often linked to giants. The name Anak means very tall and strong. The Anakim's resilience in Canaan, which is talked about in Joshua, shows not only how hard things were for the Israelites, but also how traditions and lineages can live on and affect future generations, even after everyone tries to get rid of them. The Bible writings can be read in different ways because they include historische feiten, religieuze interpretaties, and mythen. The story of the explorers, the character of Anak, and what happened to the Anakim in Canaan show how hard it was for the Israelites to settle in the Promised Land. They are connected to a web of historical events, divine beslissingen, and human choices that have had a huge impact on the biblical story and how people have understood it over the years. The Anakim and their possible link to the mythical Nephilim zijn nog steeds erg interessant en het onderwerp van veel discussie in het veld van Bijbelstudies. The Anakim were a group of huge people who lived in the hilly areas of Canaan. Their story is interesting because it is similar to stories about the Nephilim, die ook werden beschreven als zijnde erg lang en erg sterk. The line of the Anakim that came out in the flood shows that God's rules and human relationships are complicated and have been for generations. These beings aren't as mysterious as the Nephilim from before the flood, but they still hold the memories of a time that everyone tried to forget. Their position in Canaan was not only a physical task for the Israelites, but it was also a test of how well they followed God's directions, not to mix with people who were thought to be bad. There are different ways to describe the Anakim's size and personality, but they are usually described as scary giants. They may not be as big as the Nephilim, but they are definitely bigger and scarier than normal men. Their towns are fortified, and their ability to go to war shows that they are a militarily advanced society, ready to protect their land against Israeli invaders. Different ideas exist about where the Anakim came from. One theory is that they are direct children of the Nephilim through a bloodline that escaped the flood in some unknown way. Another is that they are the result of new unions between gods and humans, making the same mistakes that were made in the past. Another idea is that they might have been born from marriages between Israelite men and Canaanite women, which was against God's rules and produced a generation that was seen as evil. The Bible tells of Joshua's battle against the Anakim, which shows that God wanted to get rid of these huge creatures from the Promised Land, just like the flood got rid of the Nephilim. According to God's instructions, Joshua leads a cruel campaign that nearly wipes out the Anakim, securing Israelite rule over Canaan and confirming the power of their laws and God. The fact that giants are mentioned in later Bible stories, like when David and his powerful troops fought Ishbi-Benob and other very tall and strong people, shows that the topic of giants is still studied and interesting. These stories are relics from a time when the supernatural and the everyday mixed in ways that were hard to understand and niet de regels van de tijd volgden. Because of this, the story of the Anakim, which has historical and religious ties to the Nephilim, is a warning of how difficult it is to follow God's rules and resist human temptations, as well as to deal with the problems of today and yesterday. Each encounter and story of a giant in the sacred texts is not only a story of a physical fight, but also of the spiritual and moral battles that people face on their way to a place where God rules. It's important to think about the many layers of tales, history, and religion that make up the stories of the biblical giants as we come to the end of our journey through them. The Nephilim, the Anakim, and the Rephaim were all very different in where they came from and where they were going, but their differences show a lot of exchanges between God and people, mistakes and redemptions. The Rephaim, whose name comes from Rapha and suggests a separate bloodline, had less to do with the realms of the dead. In Bible mythology, they are seen as giants on mysterious figurin. The thought that these beings could be grouped together under the name Nephilim, because of their size and scary image, shows how people tend to put the unknown and scary things into categories they already know. This is shown by the story of the spies in Numbers 13, who think the people who live in Canaan are Nephilim, when they are actually not. They use a word that has a lot of historical and religious meaning to talk about powerful people, who may not have been straight children of fallen angels, but rather the result of mixed lineages or just very tall humans. This false belief may have kept a tale alive door ordinary, earthly giants, to toveren in mythische goddelijke wezens. The pre-flood Nephilim were actually creatures born from the union of fallen angels and human women. What about the giants that kwamen na de vloed, the Rephaim and the Anakim? They might not have come from the same Magisha family, but people saw them the same way because of how they looked and what stories they told about their great feats. Ultimately, the giants always end up in a tragic way because of God's plans. They often fought against the Israelites, who were God's chosen people. Heroes like Joshua and later David en zijn soldaten versloegen hen hard. These fights zijn zowel echt als symbolisch. They show the conflict between heavenly order and chaos, between chosen holiness and the remains of a world that needed to be cleaned up. It is important to recognize the depth and variety of meanings that these stories over biblical giants beaten as we close this chapter. They're not just scary stories or old warnings, they're also thoughts on God, morals, and people. They would tell us that the past, no matter how far away or verzonnen, still has questions and problems that are surprisingly relevant today. It's been fun and interesting to figure out these stories with you, getting to know the deeper meanings behind each person and event. Like me, I hope that this trip through the shadows of the ancient giants has given you both wonder and knowledge. May these stories help you learn more about how heaven and earth, the divine and the human, have always interacted with each other. If you liked the movie, please click like and let me know welke part of the story interested you the most. Or if there is another religious subject you'd like us to talk about, it is very important to us that you take part. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.